Hey guys! Tonight, we begin not in the glittering halls you've seen in paintings, but in the smells those paintings politely left out. It's Versailles, the crown jewel of France, where chandeliers sparkled and fountains sang, but behind the gilded doors lurked odors, filth, and hygiene habits that would make you grateful for modern plumbing. The world is dazzling, extravagant, and, if you take a deep breath, absolutely foul. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the quiet hum of the night surround you. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, just not too deeply, and drift into a palace where beauty and stench lived side by side. Congratulations, you've just stepped into Versailles. And the air is not as sweet as history made it sound. I should warn you before we step through these gilded gates. Versailles is not what it looks like on postcards. The mirrors shine, the gardens bloom, the fountains gush like liquid diamonds, but the smell hits you before the guards even check your invitation. Imagine a mixture of wet dog, overripe fruit, and a stranger's sweaty sock that's been left in a carriage for 3 weeks. Congratulations. You're now ready for a stroll through the Sun King's playground. But don't worry, we're not just here to judge. We're here to experience it. You're going to walk these halls with me, shoulder to powdered shoulder with nobles, smelling the same perfumes, the same rot, the same chamber pots hidden behind velvet curtains. Oh yes, we're time travelers with front row seats, and unfortunately for us, deodorant hasn't been invented yet. You'd think the most powerful palace in Europe would smell of roses, sandalwood, maybe a touch of imported cinnamon. Instead, Versailles was a festival of stench. Perfume was poured on by the gallon, not because people liked to smell nice, but because it was the only way to survive a day without fainting. The courtiers' faces are powdered to a ghostly white, their cheeks painted crimson like apples, but under all that makeup, their pores are fighting a losing battle against weeks, sometimes months, without soap and water. And you, standing there in your crisp, modern T-shirt, are already starting to feel itchy just from the proximity. You might want to scratch your arm. Don't. Someone might assume you have fleas, and believe me, that's not a rumor you want spreading in this court. Now, let's talk bathrooms, or the lack thereof. Versailles was a palace designed for power, not plumbing. You will not find neat little tiled rooms with flushing conveniences here. Instead, you'll find corners. Yes, corners. Staircases. Gardens. Even the halls of mirrors occasionally had a nobleman crouch behind a curtain. If you're shocked, just remember, this is the same civilization that considered bathing suspicious. And here's the best part: no matter how elegant, no matter how wealthy, everyone stank. The king himself, Louis XIV, who had a physician to inspect his royal stool every morning, wasn't exactly leading by example in the hygiene department. Imagine waking up every day to present your bodily functions like a prize goose at the fair. Romantic, isn't it? But before we judge too harshly, let's be honest. Most of us have at least one pair of socks at home that could probably hold their own at Versailles. Still, the smell is only part of the experience. The sound is just as important. Horses clattering in the courtyards, fountains splashing in perfect symmetry, silk dresses whispering as women glide down corridors, and then, from somewhere near the gilded staircases, a suspicious trickle. You follow the noise, expecting another marble fountain, but no, it's a nobleman relieving himself into a decorative urn, and everyone just pretends not to notice. Versailles etiquette meant ignoring unpleasantness, even when it was dripping into the hall. You try not to laugh, or gag, or both. But here's the thing. The nobles don't see it as gross. To them, this is normal. You, however, are trying to stand in shoes that aren't ruined. Careful, don't step there. And if you think this is bad, wait until you hear about the bedrooms. You enter one of the glittering chambers, its walls dripping with gold leaf, its ceilings a kaleidoscope of gods lounging on clouds. The bed at the center looks fit for a dream. Embroidered silks, velvet canopies, tassels that could double as climbing ropes. But don't let the sparkle fool you. That mattress has absorbed years of sweat, perfumes, spilled wine, And let's just say, bodily incidents that never got washed out. Hygiene at Versailles was not about cleaning. It was about covering. If something smelled bad, throw some lavender on it. If your wig itched, sprinkle powder until it looked snow-capped. Out of sight, out of nose. Now imagine spending the night here. The air is thick, not with romance, but with a cocktail of wax, stale breath, and chamber pot perfume. The courtiers aren't exactly brushing their teeth either. Bad breath is practically another accessory, right alongside lace cuffs and diamond buckles. Picture leaning in for a whispered secret, and being hit with a wall of fumes so strong you reconsider whether gossip is worth the price. Spoiler, it's not. And you, lucky traveler, are standing close enough to smell history's underarm. It's fascinating, it's horrifying, and it makes you grateful for every bar of soap you've ever owned. Though let's be honest, who among us hasn't spritzed deodorant instead of showering and called it good enough? Versailles just took that habit and made it a lifestyle. The hallways, by the way, were not spared. While today we imagine elegant strolls across marble floors beneath glittering chandeliers, in reality, those same halls doubled as casual toilets. Servants hustled with buckets, trailing behind nobles like janitors at a particularly extravagant sports stadium. The problem is, Versailles was huge. Buckets never caught up with everything. The smell lingered like a second population. Step carefully now. The wax on the floor is slick, and not just with candle drippings. If you slide into the path of the Dauphin, congratulations. You've just turned yourself into Versailles' slapstick. He won't laugh, but the courtiers will. A fall in the palace was a public humiliation of the highest order, right up there with stained breeches. And here's the kicker, everyone wore shoes with heels high enough to double as stilts. Imagine walking through an obstacle course of waste, perfume, and spilled wine, all while teetering like a toddler in their mother's stilettos. You pass a lady of the court, her face powdered until she looks carved from marble, her gown so wide it could seat a family of 4. She's smiling, but her teeth are dark little tombstones, some missing, others leaning precariously. Sugar was a luxury, and boy did they abuse it. Behind that porcelain mask of a face was a dental apocalypse. Yet she still leans close, batting her lashes, asking if you've heard the latest scandal. You lean back instinctively. She mistakes this for flirting. Things escalate quickly at Versailles. It makes you think, maybe modern dating apps aren't so bad. At least profiles don't come with smell-o-vision. And now, we reach the PICDRA assistants, the royal gardens. Everyone swoons over the fountains, the carefully pruned hedges, the endless avenues lined with statues of gods. It's paradise on earth, until you remember the palace lacked sufficient latrines. Guests wandering the gardens would, well, make do, among the shrubbery. What you thought was morning dew might be something else entirely. Think of that next time you picnic in the grass. And don't even ask about the fountains. Let's just say some people mistook them for very fancy basins. Suddenly, those sparkling jets of water don't feel so refreshing, do they? But perhaps the most surreal part is how everyone pretended none of this was happening. Etiquette demanded silence on such matters. Smells, ignore them. Fleas, just scratch gracefully. Chamber pots in the hallway, step around with dignity. Versailles was a grand illusion, a stage play of elegance, with filth hidden beneath the brocade. And the courtiers, desperate to remain in the king's orbit, played along without question. Now here's the secret: no one tells you the stink was not just physical, it was political. To live at Versailles meant surrendering comfort, privacy, and yes, basic hygiene, in exchange for power. The filth became part of the performance, a symbol of proximity to the Sun King. And if you were close enough to smell it, you were close enough to influence him. You may be gagging, but they were thriving, or at least pretending to. It's amazing what people will tolerate when ambition is on the line. Just think about your own office fridge. And if you think sweaty courtiers and garden surprises are as bad as it gets, just wait until you step into the king's private world. The closer you get to Louis himself, the stranger the smells and the rituals become. You're finally ushered into the king's inner chambers, where the rituals of Versailles reach their strangest extremes. Here, life was lived as theatre. Even waking up was a performance. attended by dozens of nobles who jostled for the honor of handing Louis his stockings. You'd think a man called the Sun King would rise with fresh linens, warm baths and a breeze of roses. But no, he rose into the same suffocating air, heavy with the musk of last night's chamber pot, and the collective perfume of courtiers who hadn't touched water in weeks. Bathing, you see, was considered dangerous. Doctors warned it open pores and let disease creep in. So while fountains sparkled outside, Louis himself bathed rarely. A splash of scented water on the hands, a dab of linen cloth across the face. That was clean. You might be feeling itchy already. Don't worry, so was half the court. And oh, the wigs. Imagine an entire room of men with artificial forests on their heads, towering constructions of horsehair, grease, and powder. They itched, they crawled, and occasionally they fell apart mid-conversation. A man's dignity could collapse in a heap of tangled curls at his feet, but wigs were necessary to cover smallpox scars, baldness, and, let's be blunt, lice infestations. The only thing more terrifying than what lived inside the wig was what lived underneath it. You glance at the king's own wig, powdered until it resembles a frosted cake. He adjusts it carefully, as if the fate of France depends on its tilt. Maybe it does. After all, fashion here is politics, and every strand of hair has its role to play. It makes you grateful for modern hats. Baseball caps may not scream power, but at least they don't double as insect hotels. Now let's talk medicine. The king's doctors were a permanent fixture, not because Louis was particularly ill, though he often was, but because he enjoyed being treated. Bloodletting, enemas, purges, these were regular events, witnessed by courtiers who crowded the chamber like fans at a rock concert. Every royal bodily function was public property. The king's stool, in particular, was inspected for signs of health. Imagine a room full of nobles craning their necks for a glimpse, as if Versailles were less a palace and more an odd medical reality show. And this wasn't just Louis. Courtiers, too, submitted themselves to cures that often made things worse. Tooth aches. Pull the tooth, no anesthetic. Stomach pain. Drink mercury, because why not? A rash. Cover it in lead makeup and pretend it's not there. The cure was often deadlier than the disease. The smell of medicines mixed with the stench of sweat and perfume created a cocktail so dizzying it could knock you flat. Yet everyone kept smiling, bowing, and whispering gossip, as if fainting in a gilded hall were simply part of the schedule. And in a way it was. You try to imagine this as your daily routine. Wake up, be examined by doctors, endure wigs, gossip in hallways that reek like open sewers, attend banquets where food is heavily spiced not for taste, but to disguise rot, and then collapse into a mattress that hasn't seen clean sheets in months. The glamour of Versailles starts to peel away like cheap wallpaper. Still, there's something magnetic about it. The chandeliers sparkle, the violins play, and the courtiers laugh through rotten teeth, convinced they are the epitome of civilization. You almost admire the commitment. It's like watching someone insist their cat is a dog. You know it's wrong, but the dedication is impressive. But the real horror isn't the wigs, the perfumes, or the chamber pots. It's the food. Wait until you see what's served at Versailles banquets, and how it's stored, before reaching the royal table. Spoiler, you'll never look at leftovers the same way again. The banquet hall is the beating heart of Versailles, and tonight you've been granted entry. The chandeliers blaze, the tables stretch endlessly, and silver platters glisten with promise. At first glance, it's dazzling, like stepping into the world's most over-decorated buffet. But then the smells creep in. Not the aroma of roasting meats or fresh bread, but something heavier, a soreness that clings to the air, as if the kitchen had given up sometime in the last century. You edge closer, and suddenly it makes sense. The food looks marvelous, but the preservation methods are primitive at best. Meat is aged, but not in the gourmet sense. It's simply been sitting around. Spices cloak the rot, heavy sauces smother the odor, but beneath it all, you can still taste the creeping decay. Picture eating weak, old leftovers you forgot in the back of your fridge, then imagine doing it with a string quartet serenading you. Congratulations, you've just had your first Versailles feast. And yet, they loved it. Goose stuffed with truffles, venison drowned in wine, exotic fruits imported at ruinous expense. Every bite screamed luxury, even if it also whispered food poisoning. Nobles devoured the courses, chatting through mouths of half-chewed meat, wine spilling from goblets, grease glistening on powdered faces. Manners were secondary to spectacle. Food wasn't about taste, it was about status. The more lavish the dish, the closer to the king you were allowed to sit. You eye a platter of oysters. They shine, tempting, but you know better. Those shells were hauled from coastal markets days ago, without refrigeration, without ice. To eat one is to gamble. Some nobles do, grinning wide, certain their rank protects them from indigestion. It doesn't. Nothing protects anyone from a bad oyster. And the drinking. Wine flowed like rivers. Water was considered unsafe, so alcohol replaced it at every meal. By dessert, the nobles are flushed, laughing too loudly, their wigs slipping as they lean into one another. Beneath the perfume and powder, sweat rolls freely, turning already stained silk into dark maps of excess. The palace glitters, the music swells, and the stench climbs steadily with every toast. You can't help but think of modern buffets. At least today, sneeze guards exist. At Versailles there were no guards, just sneezes, and coughs, and greasy fingers dipping back into communal bowls. Sharing was caring, whether you liked it or not. The servants scurry back and forth, balancing trays, sweeping up bones, and quietly emptying chamber pots tucked behind curtains. Yes, even in the banquet halls, the toilets followed the people. One corner hides a velvet, screen nook where a noble excuses himself mid-course, then returns moments later for dessert as if nothing happened. No one blinks, no one comments. Everyone continues, pretending the air isn't thicker than soup. By now, you're queasy. The music no longer distracts you. Your stomach churns in sympathy with every noble who's eaten too much questionable goose. You glance toward the gardens, craving fresh air, but even that is a trap. The doors open, and with the breeze comes the odor of 1,000 guests using the hedges as toilets. The perfumes of Versailles are relentless, an orchestra of scents where rot always plays first violin. But here's the wildest part to them. This was civilization's peak. To them, this was refinement. The filth was invisible, disguised under etiquette, ritual, and extravagance. And you modern traveler can't stop noticing it. You see the cracked lips of powdered ladies sipping spoiled wine. You smell the wigs of noblemen shedding lice like dandruff. You step carefully around a spill that might be soup, or might not. It's grotesque, it's dazzling, and it's addictive. Because despite everything, Versailles shines. The gold, the mirrors, the endless dances and whispers. They catch you, they pull you in, until you almost forget the stink under your nose. Almost. You slip out of the banquet at last, wandering the corridors alone. The candles gutter, the chatter fades, but the smell never leaves. It's baked into the palace itself, clinging to the draperies, the walls, the marble floors. Versailles is a perfume bottle cracked open and left too long in the sun. Sweet, rotting, unforgettable. You pause in the silent hall of mirrors, staring at your reflection. For a moment, you wonder if you've grown paler, powdered by the air itself, your hair itching from invisible fleas. Perhaps time has caught you here, binding you to the palace like the courtiers before you. Perhaps you too are now part of the illusion. And if you think the banquets were bad, just wait until you see where all this waste ended up, and how Versailles became not just the dirtiest palace in Europe, but one of the most dangerous. You wake in Versailles, and the first thing you notice is not the golden ceiling or the silken drapes, but the sound. Somewhere beyond your chamber door, there's a shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, and then a splash. Not the elegant trickle of fountains, but something far less poetic. Welcome, traveler. Today we are following the waste. If you thought the palace smelled yesterday, brace yourself. Versailles was a palace built without plumbing, and what went in had to come out. Chamber pots overflowed nightly, buckets sloshed down staircases, and servants carried more waste than silver. The palace was quite literally drowning in itself. Step carefully now. The hallway glitters with candlelight, but the floor is slick. A servant passes, clutching a heavy pot draped with cloth. The smell escapes anyway. He hurries toward the nearest stairwell. Because there are no toilets here, no drains, no hidden underground system. Instead, the waste is carried outside, sometimes to be dumped in cesspits, other times just hurled into the palace gardens. Yes, the same gardens poets wrote sonnets about. You walk beside him, pinching your nose. He tips the pot over a railing, and with a wet cascade, the contents fall into the courtyard below. Imagine the guests arriving later. Their carriages rolling through puddles that are not rain. That crunch under the wheels. That's Versailles grit, the sort that never washes off. And yet, no one blinked. Waste was everywhere, invisible only because everyone pretended not to notice. Step into a stairwell alcove, and you'll likely find a nobleman's accident, tucked behind a curtain. Wander into the gardens, and you'll stumble on bushes fertilized more directly than you'd care to know. The fountains sparkled, but the soil was a hazard zone. Versailles was less paradise, more biohazard wrapped in gold leaf. Now, don't judge too harshly. In the 17th century, sanitation was primitive everywhere, but Versailles was unique because it tried so hard to disguise the filth. Perfume, music, endless ritual, all of it a mask. The palace was like a man in a dazzling coat, who hadn't washed in months from a distance, glorious, up close, unbearable. You glance up at the gilded balconies, where noblewomen lean and gossip, their gowns brushing dangerously close to the drips below. They laugh, adjusting their wigs, pretending not to smell what everyone smells. Etiquette demanded silence. No matter what your nose told you, your mouth stayed shut. It makes you think? Modern city sewers are miracles we rarely thank. The next time you flush, whisper a prayer of gratitude. You're living the dream Versailles never achieved. The smell follows you into the kitchens. Enormous fires roar, pots boil, and cooks shout over one another. At first it seems lively, warm, almost comforting, until you notice the scurrying shapes in the corners. Rats, bold as soldiers, dart between barrels of flour and sacks of grain. They feast freely, tails flicking, eyes bright in the firelight. Servants shrug. Rats were not pests here. They were permanent residents. Some grew so fat you'd think they were part of the staff. The waste of Versailles fed them well. Droppings litter the storerooms, mixed with flour, swept aside with a wave of the hand. And if you wondered why half the court had stomach ailments, here is your answer. Bread baked with rat traces, stews flavored with extra protein. A true feast of the Sun King. But the filth wasn't confined to food. The very air was dangerous. Buckets of human waste were flung out windows into courtyards, where they dried into powder and rose again with the wind. Each breath at Versailles carried more than perfume. If you've ever sneezed during spring pollen season, imagine the pollen replaced with powdered waste. Congratulations, you've just inhaled Versailles. You might laugh, but there's a reason epidemics flourished. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid. Diseases thrived in a palace where water was feared and filth ignored. And yet, the courtiers strutted in lace, convinced they were Europe's most refined creatures. You almost admire the denial. Almost. It's the denial that fascinates you most. Walk with me to the fountains. From a distance, they glitter like jewels. Up close you notice the water is murky, the basins green with algae. Children splash in them, nobles toss flower petals. Lovers whisper by their edge. But occasionally, a servant dumps a bucket of chamber pot contents here too. The fountains were ornaments, not sanctuaries. Their water was not for drinking, yet somehow it touched everything at Versailles. You stand by one, breathing through your sleeve. The roses nearby smell faintly of lavender, faintly of decay. It's strange, isn't it? Beauty and filth locked together, inseparable. Versailles was never just gold and perfume. It was rock gilded with diamonds. And just when you think you've adjusted, a nobleman strides past you, lifts his silk coat, and squats behind a hedge with all the nonchalance of tying a shoe. He nods politely at you, then resumes his stroll, wig perfectly in place, dignity somehow untouched. Welcome to Versailles etiquette. Don't mention it. Don't acknowledge it. Just keep walking. You can't help but chuckle. Imagine trying that at a modern garden party. One complaint on Yelp and the place would be ruined forever. Versailles. It thrived on silence. Now, let's follow the waste as it leaves the palace. Beyond the grand gardens lie cesspits, huge, stinking holes where refuse collects. Servants dump buckets endlessly. The piles rising, steaming, alive with flies. At night, the pits glow faintly, vapors shimmering in torchlight. Some claim the fumes were poisonous, that to stand too close was to risk madness. Perhaps they weren't wrong. The smell clings to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. You want to bathe, to scrub yourself raw. But here's the twist: if you lived here, you wouldn't. You'd believe, like everyone else, that bathing was harmful. You'd powder your face, dab yourself with perfume, and join the denial. That's the magic of Versailles. It pulls you into its illusion, until you almost forget the rot under your feet. Almost. And if you think cesspits are the worst it gets, wait until you hear how Versailles dealt with disease. The palace wasn't just filthy. It was a breeding ground for plagues, each outbreak reshaping life inside these golden walls. The cesspits bubble behind you, their fumes rising like invisible smoke, and as you step back into the palace, you begin to realize the true cost of this filth. Not just the stench, not just the embarrassment, but sickness itself. Versailles was a breeding ground for disease, and disease never asked permission before entering gilded doors. Smallpox was perhaps the most feared. It crept silently through the palace corridors, carried by a cough, a touch, the simple closeness of bodies that never washed. Imagine a crowded salon, powdered wigs brushing together, rouge, painted cheeks pressed in greeting, hands clasped in ritual politeness. The disease leapt from one noble to another like sparks from a fire. Spots would appear, fever would rise, and in the cramped air of Versailles, recovery was uncertain. Some bore scars for life, others vanished altogether. But smallpox was only one spectre. Dysentery, the cruel stomach plague, was a frequent guest. Its origins. You've already seen them. Water laced with waste, food flavored with rats, air heavy with filth. To suffer dysentery at Versailles was to suffer in public. Remember, there was no privacy here. Beds were shared, rooms were thin-walled, and toilets non-existent. A nobleman with stomach illness might collapse mid-ceremony, his silk trousers soiled, his dignity shredded. And yet the rituals continued. The Sun King demanded order, and order meant pretending nothing was wrong. Typhoid fever stalked the palace as well. Again, the water system, or rather, the lack of one, played its part. Wells near cesspits, contaminated fountains, buckets rinsed but never cleaned. Servants fell first, then nobles. Some survived with trembling hands and lifelong weakness. Others became names written in the endless registers of Versailles' burials, quickly forgotten beneath the weight of the next banquet. And plague, yes, even plague, hovered at the edges. Versailles was not immune to Europe's great scourges. Though the palace tried to wall itself off from the world, rats and fleas carried their own invitations. When plague arrived, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Some courtiers fled, others prayed. Most powdered their wigs, sprayed their perfume, and continued dancing, as though denial itself might protect them. The irony was cruel. Versailles, symbol of order and control, could not control the smallest of enemies. Fleas in a wig, lice in a gown, a flea bite hidden beneath lace stockings, these were the assassins of kings and queens. And yet, life went on. Ceremonies unfolded each morning. Music played in the Hall of Mirrors. Perfumed letters were exchanged. Lovers whispered in alcoves. Children ran in gardens fertilized by filth. Versailles was a paradox both magnificent and monstrous, glorious and grotesque. Take a moment to picture a single day. Dawn breaks. Servants empty chamber pots into the corridors. Courtiers rise coughing, scratching at lice. Breakfast is served, bread speckled with rat traces. Milk soured overnight, meat just beginning to turn. The courtiers eat anyway, hungry and eager for ceremony. Midday the gardens are crowded. Behind hedges, nobles relieve themselves. At the fountains, children toss flowers into water that smells faintly of rot. Evening comes, candles are lit, and the salons shine with jewels and laughter. Beneath the floorboards, rats feast. Beyond the windows, cesspit steam. Above the chandeliers, lice crawl in wigs. And through it all, Versailles pretends. Pretends it is the heart of civilization. Pretends it is the pinnacle of refinement. Pretends it does not stink. The pretense is perhaps the most fascinating detail, because Versailles was not a palace of ignorance. The nobles knew. They had noses, stomachs, fevers like anyone else. But to acknowledge the filth was to acknowledge weakness, and weakness was forbidden in the theatre of the Sun King. So they powdered more, perfumed more, laughed louder, and hid the truth beneath silks and ceremony. In the quiet of night, though, the truth returned. Servants scurried through dark corridors with sloshing buckets. Rats gnawed in the kitchens. Noblemen scratched rashes until their sheets stained with blood. The palace sighed with its sickness, as though Versailles itself were alive, a golden beast rotting from within. You stand now in the Hall of Mirrors. Candles blaze, music drifts, jewels sparkle. You look at the polished glass and see yourself reflected 100 times. But behind the reflection lies the truth you've walked through today: the waste, the rats, the diseases, the denial. Versailles was never just a palace. It was a masquerade, a glittering mask stretched across the face of filth. And perhaps that is why it endures in our imagination. Not just as a symbol of power, but as a warning. No matter how much gold you lay over rot, the stench will seep through. Versailles teaches us that beauty can coexist with horror, that splendor can grow from sewage, that denial can become an art form. It is both inspiring and disgusting, a reminder that history is never as clean as we wish it to be. Close your eyes now. Hear the rustle of silk, the cough of a sick noble, the splash of a bucket against stone. Smell the perfume and the waste intertwined. Versailles is gone, but in your mind it lingers, a palace that glittered even as it decayed. And tomorrow, when you open your eyes again, we will walk further. Versailles still has more secrets to share. You wake in a bed so grand it could double as a cathedral. The canopy is heavy with velvet, embroidered with gold thread, and so thick it traps the smell of the previous night inside. You sit up, rubbing your eyes, and realize the air feels close, damp, almost sour. A mix of sweat, perfume, and something unmentionable that must have happened near the chamber pot in the corner. Welcome to a Versailles bedroom. At first glance, it's dazzling. The walls are painted with gods and heroes. Cherubs float above you in murals, and gilded moldings catch the candlelight. But then your nose twitches again. The reality of this room is less Olympus, more locker room. These chambers were crowded. Nobles slept in the same room, attendants hovered in corners, and sometimes visitors wandered in just to watch you wake up. Privacy was a concept reserved for peasants. Here at Versailles, every act, from sleeping to sneezing, was a performance. Your mattress, stuffed with straw and horsehair, crackles faintly as you swing your legs over the side. The sheets are clean by Versailles standards, which is to say they were last washed during a previous war. They smell faintly of mildew, and something about the dampness makes you wonder whether the servant, who smoothed them last night, also spilled the chamber pot. Best not to ask. And there it is, the infamous chamber pot itself. A porcelain bowl painted with delicate flowers, trying very hard to distract from its purpose. Some nobles had them disguised as stools, little furniture pieces with a surprise inside. The smell is faint but insistent, curling upward like an invisible ribbon. You glance at it, then glance away. No one empties it immediately, and for hours, the air of the Sun King's court is perfumed by human digestion. Now here's the fun part: in the grandest rooms, you wouldn't even be alone with your pot. You'd be expected to go, while servants stood by, perhaps handing you cloth or simply waiting with solemn faces. Imagine explaining that to your modern self. At least in today's world, you can lock a bathroom door. At Versailles, the lock was replaced with etiquette. Pretend it isn't happening, and all is well. You shuffle to the window, pulling back heavy curtains. The gardens blaze before you, stretching into infinity, perfectly symmetrical, each hedge trimmed within an inch of its life. The morning sun gilds the fountains. For a moment, the smell in your room almost fades. Almost. Then you catch the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Nobles are gathering, ready for another ritual of the Sun King. You, however, are still stuck in your own stink. Powder and perfume are waiting, your armor against the inevitable assault of noses around you. Because here's the truth: everyone reeks, but the trick is to make your reek more fashionable than your neighbors. You pour scented water into a basin. The scent is strong: roses, orange peel musk. But it's not for drinking. It's for dabbing on a handkerchief, sprinkling on your wrists, maybe splashing on your wig. Washing, as in soap and scrubbing. That's reserved for children and skeptics. Everyone knows water spreads disease, or so the doctors say. Better to mask than to cleanse. A servant enters, carrying powders. Your wig is set upon your head with a flourish, as if crowning you with a bouquet of dusty horsehair. Flour, chop, crushed bone, whatever keeps it white. You sneeze, but no one notices. Everyone sneezes. Versailles is a palace of powdered noses. Your cheeks are rouged, your lips painted, your perfume dabbed. The transformation is complete. You are ready for the day, though under it all you are still sticky, itchy, unwashed. And here's the irony: the more layers you add, the worse it gets. Powder clogs your pores, perfume mixes with sweat, rouge cracks on dry skin. Versailles' beauty was its own kind of filth, just dressed in silk. You glance at yourself in the mirror. Magnificent, yes. Attractive, perhaps. Comfortable. Absolutely not. The wig itches, the powder chokes, the perfume stings your nose. You remind yourself that this is fashion, that this is power. Then again, so is squeezing into skinny jeans today, and nobody's calling that hygienic either. Now comes breakfast. You shuffle to the salon, joining other nobles who are equally powdered, equally perfumed, equally itchy. Platters arrive: bread, fruit, meat. The bread is stale, the fruit half rotting, the meat suspiciously glossy. You eat anyway. Hunger doesn't wait for freshness. A noble coughs nearby, and you try not to notice the droplets landing on the food. Germ theory hasn't arrived yet, but your stomach knows better. Still you smile. Always smile. Versailles is a performance. And no performance is more important than the one happening at breakfast. If you thought waking up in filth was bad, wait until you see how Versailles prepared for bed. Evening descends on Versailles like a velvet curtain, and with it comes the peculiar ritual of getting ready for bed. A ceremony as public as waking. Imagine ending your day with an audience. Not your family, not your cat perched at the end of the blanket, but courtiers, ministers, attendants, all gathered to watch you slowly, gloriously, climb into your sheets. You might think this is an exaggeration. It isn't. For the king, going to bed was a state occasion, an event with witnesses. A chosen few were allowed the honor of holding his slippers, adjusting his sheets, or handing him a glass of watered wine. Can you imagine Netflixing with a crowd clapping politely every time you yawn? Versailles turned something as intimate as sleep into political theater. But let's linger in your chamber before the performance begins. The curtains are drawn, candles flicker, and the room is heavy with perfume that cannot mask the underlying odors. The chamber pot in the corner is fuller now, its presence undeniable, though still ignored by etiquette. Sheets have been fluffed, though fluffing doesn't change the fact that they are streaked with the faint yellow of sweat and the shadow of last week's stains. The mattress creaks ominously, like it knows it's going to be punished by another restless night. Servants bustle around you, brushing wigs, shaking powder, laying out nightshirts. But nightshirts are not the freshly washed cotton you're used to. These are stiff with days of wear, thick with perfume to disguise what can't be cleaned. You slide into yours and immediately itch. You want to scratch, but you hold back. Scratching makes noise, and noise draws attention. The last thing you need is whispers that you've caught fleas, and then comes the bed itself. Grand yes, massive yes, comfortable, debatable. The canopy is so heavy it traps the air inside, turning your bed into a private greenhouse of sweat. The mattress is uneven, stuffed with straw that shifts like restless animals beneath you. You roll over, and something crunches, probably a lost louse, maybe a crumb from last night's bread. You decide not to check. Sleep at Versailles is never quiet. Beyond the bedchamber, courtiers shuffle in corridors, gossip echoing through thin walls. In the gardens, guards march. From the kitchens below comes the faint scratching of rats celebrating their midnight feast. Even in bed, Versailles is alive, restless, noisy. Silence is impossible. And then there's the scratching, always the scratching. Wigs carried lice, bedding carried fleas, and bodies carried both. Imagine drifting off to the sound of your own fingernails working furiously at your scalp, or your legs twitching from the sudden bite of a flea beneath the sheet. Sleep was less a rest than a truce, and the enemy was always inside your bed. Yet you are never truly alone. Servants might sleep in the same chamber, on pallets by the wall, ready to fetch water, or empty the pot at a moment's notice. Sometimes nobles snored nearby, sharing quarters for convenience or status. Privacy was not only rare, it was suspect. If you wanted to be alone at Versailles, people assumed you were hiding something. Still, exhaustion eventually wins. You close your eyes, ignoring the scratching, the smell, the whispers outside. You drift into uneasy dreams, lulled by the flicker of candlelight and the faint trickle of a fountain somewhere in the gardens. You dream of cool, clean sheets, of baths scented with soap, of windows that open to fresh air instead of cesspit fumes. Dreams your 17th century body will never know. But just as sleep settles, the bed itself reminds you it has secrets. The sheets are never washed often, the mattress is home to generations of vermin. And the canopy traps every odor from every night before. Your bed is not a sanctuary. It is a battlefield. And every night, Versailles nobles fought it with powder, perfume and denial. You wake in the dark, scratching. The candle has guttered out. The chamber pot smells stronger now. A servant shifts in the corner, coughing softly. You roll over the mattress, groaning like an old ship, and try again to find peace. Outside, the palace sleeps. But even in sleep, Versailles never lets you forget filth is everywhere, even here, between silken sheets. If you thought nights were restless, just wait until you see how the palace kitchens turned food into another source of disgust. The moment you descend into the kitchens of Versailles, the fantasy collapses. Upstairs, chandeliers blaze, silk swish, perfumes choke the air. Down here, heat smothers you, smoke stings your eyes, and the smell, dear heavens, the smell, hits like a cannonball. It is a perfume of grease, sweat and rot, layered thick as butter on stale bread. Boiling pots hiss, spits crackle with half-charred meat, and flies, bold as nobility, land freely on every surface. Rats dart across the floor, their tails flicking in triumph as they vanish under counters. Cats sometimes chase them, sometimes nap in corners, pretending none of this is their problem. You pull your sleeve across your nose, but it's no use. The stench creeps through cloth, up your nostrils, and lodges itself stubbornly in your brain. Imagine the world's worst fast food kitchen, then multiply it by 50, then leave it uncleaned for a century. Welcome to Versailles cuisine. Now here's the thing, this is no small household kitchen. Versailles employed hundreds of cooks, scullions, spit boys, bakers, butchers, and servants just to keep the food flowing. Every day entire herds of animals arrive at oxen, sheep, pigs, geese, ducks, rabbits. Mountains of vegetables, most already bruised, crates of fruit half spoiled, sacks of flowers often damp. It all had to be stored somewhere, and the somewhere was rarely clean. Picture cavernous pantries stacked with meat sweating in the heat, barrels of fish giving off sharp ammonia, cheeses oozing into puddles on the floor. Refrigeration, none. Ice was a rare treasure, saved for royal drinks or the occasional sorbet. Most meat simply sat until it smelled questionable, at which point a clever cook drowned it in spices and wine, until no one could taste the decay. And speaking of wine, it flowed everywhere. Not because everyone was a connoisseur, but because water was unsafe. The palace wells, remember, mingled merrily with cesspits, so wine, beer, and watered wine were the only options. Even children drank it. The kitchens practically ran on barrels. Barrels rolling down corridors. Barrels cracked open at dawn. Barrels emptied by night. If you think your coffee addiction is strong, Versailles would outdrink you before breakfast. The noise down here is a symphony of chaos. Knives thud on wooden blocks. Pans clatter, fires roar in massive hearths. Orders are shouted, insults traded, laughter bursts out when a servant slips in grease. It's not refined, not genteel. It's the engine room of a gilded ship, and everyone is covered in sweat. Now lean in closer to one of those spits. A whole deer is turning, glistening fat dripping into the flames. The smell is mouth-watering, until you notice the blackened patches where the fire caught too high. The half raw underside the boy forgot to turn, the swarm of flies feasting on the dripping juices. That's the meat destined for noble lips. And because everything here is about appearances, the chard outside will be cut away, sauces poured liberally, and voile, luxury cuisine. Bread, meanwhile, is its own adventure. The bakers work all night in ovens so hot they leave with blisters. Flour is often stretched with chalk or ground bones to make it last longer. The loaves come out hard, dense, often grey, yet on golden platters upstairs, they're passed around as delicacies. You bite into one and chip a tooth. Congratulations, you're eating like royalty. The smells change as you walk. A cauldron of onion soup boiling thick and sulphurous, a vat of cabbage stewing until it could repel an army, trays of fish whose eyes are cloudy with age. You gag slightly and one of the scullions laughs. To him, this is normal. To you, it's a trial by fire. And oh, the butter. Mountains of it, turning yellow at the edges, sometimes flecked with mold. But cooks scrape it smooth, whip it into sauces, pour it on everything. Butter masks sins. Butter hides the truth. Butter is Versailles' secret weapon against food that should have been buried yesterday. You watch as a servant carries a platter upstairs. The meat is carved beautifully, arranged with herbs, drizzled in sauce. It looks divine. But you know where it came from. You've seen the rats that sniffed it, the flies that landed on it, the spit, the boy who sneezed over it. That first bite upstairs. It's a miracle of presentation, not hygiene. And yet the nobles adore it. They rave about the flavors, the richness, the abundance. They boast of Versailles feasts that last for hours, with course after course arriving like waves. What they never mention is that each wave smells faintly of decay, that each bite risks dysentery, that each cup of wine hides the taste of water gone bad. Still, you have to admit, it's strangely magnificent. To feed thousands every day in this chaos is a feat of organization, even if cleanliness is sacrificed along the way. Versailles kitchens are not pretty, but they are powerful. Without them, the illusion upstairs collapses. And if you think the kitchens are bad, just wait until you see what the food did to the toilets. Or rather, the lack of them. You follow the servants' platter up the twisting corridors, still hearing the clamor of the kitchens fading behind you. By the time you arrive in the salons above, the transformation is staggering. What was a sweaty slab of questionable venison below has become an artwork here. Golden platters gleam, garnished with sprigs of parsley that were almost certainly washed in water you wouldn't dare sip. The nobles swoon at the sight, clapping their hands with delight, as if the food itself were a courtier making its entrance. A roasted swan arrives next, its feathers carefully replaced after cooking, so that it looks as though it might take flight at any moment. Beside it comes a pie, decorated with intricate pastry leaves, inside of which live birds are trapped, fluttering, ready to be released when the crust is cut. It's theatre, pure and simple, and like most theatre it hides what goes on backstage. You sneak a taste of the soup. Thick, oily, saltier than the sea. It masks everything. The turnips might be soft from rot, the broth boiled from bones already nibbled by vermin, but the salt covers all sins. The nobles sip, smacking their lips, praising the chef's genius. No one mentions the faint odor that clings to the spoon. Desserts, of course, are the crowning jewel. Towers of candied fruit, tarts so sweet your teeth ache at the sight, fountains of melted sugar shaped into mythological figures. Sugar was power, expensive, rare, shipped across oceans, and Versailles drowned in it. But sugar rots as quickly as smiles. The cakes glisten with sticky gloss, already drawing ants before they've even been sliced. A mouse scurries boldly along a sideboard, eyes gleaming, tail whipping. The servants pretend not to notice, and the nobles laugh, assuming it's all part of the rustic charm. And here's a secret no noble would ever admit. Half of what is served at Versailles never gets eaten. The sheer quantity is overwhelming. Courses pile upon courses, meat upon meat, sauces upon sauces. Nobles pick delicately, nibbling here and there, then send their plates away half full. Where does it go? To the servants, of course. And by the time it reaches them, the food has been poured at, sneezed on, handled a dozen times. The feast is for show, not sustenance. Yet for all its filth, Versailles' food carried influence. Recipes spread from these kitchens to Paris, then to the world. Dishes born of desperation, meat drowned in sauce to mask decay, vegetables boiled to mush for safety, became fashionable trends. Even the powdered wigs upstairs were dusted with flour stolen from bread that could have fed the hungry. Versailles turned waste into fashion, and the world copied it. As the feast stretches late into the night, you notice the nobles growing sluggish. Bellies swell beneath corsets, faces flush red, eyes water. Some excuse themselves to vomit discreetly into gilded basins, part of the ritual. Others simply loosen their stays and continue. Indigestion was as common as gossip here. No one expected to leave a banquet without a stomachache. And when the feast finally ends, the servants begin clearing away mountains of scraps. Bones picked clean by rats before the plates are even stacked. Fruit rinds already turning brown. Pools of spilled wine soaking into the carpets. The salons reek faintly of grease and sweat, layered beneath perfume. It is the smell of Versailles' satisfaction. You walk back toward the kitchens, watching as leftovers are carted off. Some are dumped into pits, others carried to servants' quarters, still others smuggled out to feed beggars at the gates. The chain of filth never ends. Upstairs, it is luxury. Down here, it is survival. For the rats, it is paradise. And you realize, standing there in the smoky corridor, that food at Versailles was not nourishment. It was a mask, just like perfume, powder and silk. Beneath the sauces and sugar lay rot. Beneath the banquets lay hunger. Beneath the golden plates lay rats. Your stomach churns a little, and you swear you can still smell the onions in your hair. If you thought the kitchens were foul, wait until you see where the waste ended up once the nobles were finished with their feasts. Imagine, for a moment, the grand palace of Versailles. Marble halls, glittering chandeliers, fountains that sang in the gardens, and gilded mirrors reflecting the powdered faces of courtiers. Now take that shining image and add the smell of human waste, sharp, sour, undeniable, because Versailles, for all its beauty, was built before the age of plumbing. Let's be blunt. The palace of Versailles was a toilet with a throne room attached. The nobles may have covered themselves in silks, jewels, and powder, but beneath the satin, their bowels worked like anyone else's. And when thousands of courtiers crowded together, eating mountains of greasy meats and syrupy desserts, drinking gallons of wine, their digestive systems had a lot to contribute to the history of filth. Where did it all go? The short answer: everywhere. Versailles had chamber pots, ceramic or metal bowls tucked discreetly under chairs or behind curtains. They were supposed to be carried away and emptied regularly. Supposed to being the key phrase. Often they were left to overflow, forgotten in some corner, until the smell alone forced a servant to deal with it. Guests wandering the corridors might stumble upon an abandoned pot brimming with last night's banquets. But that was the polite method. Many courtiers didn't bother with chamber pots. They relieved themselves in stairwells, corridors, or even fireplaces. Yes, fireplaces. Imagine curling up beside a roaring fire, only to discover it had recently doubled as someone's toilet. The royal gardens fared no better. Nobles strolling among the fountains and marble statues would duck behind a hedge, squat, and leave their mark among the roses. Versailles was beautiful, yes, but step carefully. And the smell, it was unavoidable. Even the most extravagant perfumes could only mask so much. In summer, the stench rose like a living creature, slithering through salons and galleries, mingling with the aromas of sweat, spilled wine, and decaying food. The courtiers pretended not to notice. Etiquette demanded they ignore the odor, as if to acknowledge it would puncture the illusion of grandeur. Servants, of course, bore the brunt of the problem. They were the ones carrying sloshing chamber pots down endless staircases, often spilling as they went. They were the ones scrubbing waste from carpets and stone floors, gagging as they worked. And still, it was never enough. Rats, drawn to both food scraps and human waste, flourished in the palace. They darted beneath tables, gnawed through walls, scuttled over sleeping servants. Versailles may have been the center of elegance, but its rat population was more royal than the king himself. Then there was the royal family. The king himself had a guard robe, a private chamber with a chair that had a hole cut into it, a throne upon a throne. Underneath, a chamber pot collected the royal offerings. This pot, too, required emptying by servants, who must have wondered at times whether majesty really excused the smell. Courtiers, eager for favor, sometimes stood by as the king relieved himself, chatting casually, as though watching a man defecate was a sign of loyalty. In Versailles, it was. By the mid-18th century, Versailles did attempt solutions. Privies were built into walls, essentially cupboards with holes leading to cesspits below. But cesspits filled quickly. When they overflowed, the contents seeped through walls, stained ceilings, and oozed into cellars. There are records of entire rooms rendered unusable, because waste had leaked inside. Imagine a ballroom where the chandeliers sparkled overhead while, beneath your shoes, the floorboards squelched. And lest you think this was unusual, remember Versailles was enormous. Thousands lived there. Servants, courtiers, guards, cooks, maids, musicians, and nobles, all contributing to the palace's waste problem daily. Add the guests, who might arrive for festivals or hunts, swelling the numbers even more. Each person added to the tide, and Versailles became less a palace than a vast, perfumed latrine. And yet, life went on. Balls glittered, operas were performed, treaties signed, revolutions whispered. Beneath it all lay waste, a constant reminder that even kings cannot escape biology. You might pause here and think, surely the gardens, with their famous fountains and artificial lakes, were an improvement. Surely fresh air made things better. But wait until you see what Versailles did with its water system, and what floated downstream from those fountains. That, I promise, is where the filth of Versailles will truly make you gag. You might think, surely, with all the fountains, lakes, and glittering waterworks at Versailles, someone had considered a proper sewage system. After all, if Louis XVI could summon engineers to reroute rivers and build aqueducts to feed his fountains, couldn't they also pipe waste away? But that would have been practical. Versailles was not built for practicality. It was built for show. Water at Versailles flowed gloriously into fountains and cascades, dancing for the pleasure of courtiers. But waste, that was an afterthought. The palace sat on swampy land, the groundwater already too high for deep cesspits. So waste either went into shallow pits that overflowed constantly, or it was carried out in buckets and dumped nearby. Nearby being the polite way of saying, just outside the walls. Streams of filth trickled into ditches, gardens, and sometimes right back into the water sources that fed the fountains. A vicious circle, in which the same water used to dazzle the king might have been flavored by the contributions of his courtiers the week before. The smell, predictably, was appalling. Imagine strolling through the Grand Canal at sunset, the sky aflame, the gardens glowing gold, only to have the breeze shift and bring you the eye-watering reek of cesspits. Guests gagged discreetly, pressing lace handkerchiefs to powdered noses. Courtiers simply learned to breathe shallowly, taking in as little air as possible. Perfume was not fashion here, it was armor. And still the waste grew. During festivals or hunts, thousands might descend on Versailles at once. The latrines overflowed, cesspits filled, chamber pots multiplied like rabbits. Servants scrambled to dump the excess, heaving buckets into ditches that ran black and foul. And when the rains came, the filth spread everywhere. Imagine mud squelching under your shoes, only to realize the mud was not entirely mud. Nobles tracked it back into the halls, across polished floors, into ballrooms where minuets were danced. Versailles sparkled, but its shoes told another story. Of course, Versailles was not unique in this. Most European cities at the time were drowning in their own waste. London's cesspits overflowed into basements, Paris's streets ran with filth, and chamber pots were emptied from windows onto unlucky pedestrians. Versailles simply concentrated all of this into one palace, then tried to pretend it was still paradise. There are stories, half comical, half horrifying, of guests collapsing from the smell in certain wings of the palace. Some letters describe rooms rendered uninhabitable because waste had seeped through the walls. Imagine a duke, dressed in brocade and lace, sweeping into his apartments only to find the air so thick with ammonia his eyes watered instantly. And what could he do? Complain to the king. The king himself had to deal with it. Versailles belonged to everyone and to no one, and its waste was democracy at its fullest. The irony, of course, is that Versailles' fountains, the very symbol of royal grandeur, were often shut off to save water. There wasn't enough to keep them running all day. But the cesspits, they never stopped flowing. When courtiers compared Versailles to heaven, perhaps they meant it was heaven above and hell below. You might think this is the worst of it. Toilets in stairwells, cesspits oozing into salons, rats claiming the palace as their own. But wait. If you thought the waste was bad, imagine what happened when courtiers tried to mask the smells with perfumes, powders, and clothing rituals that trapped filth against the body. Versailles was not only a palace of sewage, it was a palace of unwashed flesh. And that, dear traveller, is where things get truly nauseating. The stink of Versailles was no secret. Anyone who has ever lived in a crowded house with one clogged toilet knows the kind of quiet dread that settles in the air. Now imagine that house is the size of a city block, inhabited by thousands, and the clogged toilet is, well, everything. Versailles smelled alive, in the worst way possible. And what do humans do when something reeks and we can't fix it? We try to cover it up. Enter the age of perfume, powder, wigs, and clothes that did more hiding than helping. Step into the hall of mirrors and take a deep breath. Though I don't recommend a deep one. What you'd notice first, beyond the candle wax and sweat, is a wall of perfume so thick it could knock you backward. Musk, ambergris, rosewater, lavender, orange blossom, civet, sandalwood. Courtiers doused themselves in these scents the way modern teenagers bathe in cheap body spray before going to a school dance. Perfume at Versailles wasn't just a fashion accessory, it was survival gear. The nose had to be tricked into believing the air was breathable. But let's be clear, these perfumes didn't remove the stench. They layered on top of it, mingling with odors of sweat, rot, unwashed hair, and worse. The result? A symphony of smells so powerful it could make your eyes water. Imagine lighting 20 different scented candles in your bathroom, immediately after someone forgot to flush. That was Versailles. And perfumes weren't just dabbed delicately on wrists. They were everywhere. Soaked into gloves, rubbed into wigs, sprayed on curtains, poured onto handkerchiefs. Even shoes were perfumed. One courtier bragged about carrying little silver pomanders, stuffed with herbs in each pocket, pulling them out like weapons whenever the smell got too strong. Others wore scented sachets sewn into their clothing, like portable air fresheners. Why not simply bathe? Here's where things get truly bizarre. Bathing at Versailles was seen as dangerous. Doctors believed too much water weakened the body, opening the pores to disease. A bath might be prescribed once or twice a year, but daily washing. That was madness. Water was feared almost as much as plague. So courtiers settled for dry washing, wiping the skin with cloths, rubbing with scented powders, or changing undergarments, though often not as frequently as you'd hope. Let's take a noblewoman, for example. She might wear layer upon layer of silk, brocade, lace, corsetry, and petticoats. Underneath, her skin rarely saw daylight. Instead of washing, she'd dust herself with white powder, mixed with starch or even ground lead, to give that ghostly pallor so fashionable at court.
Lid.
Imagine willingly rubbing poison into your skin every day, because someone told you it looked chic. It was the Versailles equivalent of using tanning oil in the 80s or overdoing Botox today. Pain now, regret later. And wigs, oh the wigs. They weren't just wigs, they were monuments. Towers of hair, powdered into white perfection, sometimes so tall they scraped door frames. Beneath those powdered forests lived colonies of lice, happily thriving in the warm, unwashed depths. Wigs weren't cleaned so much as refreshed brushed, powdered again, sprayed with perfume. If the lice got too bad, a noble might send the wig to a servant to boil or fumigate, but often they just scratched. In fact, silver scratching tools were sold for just this purpose, like luxury back scratchers for your scalp. Picture it, a duke leaning against a wall, discreetly fishing through his powdered wig for relief, as though checking for spare change. Perfume and powder extended to every corner of Versailles' life. Clothes, hair, furniture, even pets were perfumed. Dogs wandered the halls smelling faintly of jasmine, though they often left behind puddles that undid all the effort. Cats, too, prowled the salons, spraying the corners in ways no rosewater could mask. The palace was less Eau de Versailles, and more Eau de Versailles after 2 weeks of garbage pickup strike. And now, if you're wondering how this compares to today, think of that one friend who refuses to shower after the gym, but sprays themselves with cologne until they reek of ocean thunder, or axe explosion. That's basically Versailles' etiquette. Instead of admitting to body odor, you declared war on it with perfume, until both scents were locked in a death match. Even their mouths needed camouflage. Toothbrushes were rare, and toothpaste as we know it didn't exist. Nobles might rub their teeth with rags dipped in wine or vinegar, or chew on herbs. But most had teeth that were decayed, blackened, or missing altogether. To hide the stench of bad breath, they chewed cloves or carried little boxes of pastilles made from sugar and spices. Imagine whispering sweet nothings into someone's ear, only to realize their breath smelled like a battlefield where garlic and rot had gone 12 rounds. The irony, of course, is that Versailles was the epicenter of etiquette. Rules dictated how to bow, how to speak, how to eat, how to dance. Yet the very same nobles who mastered the art of moving gracefully in silk slippers were scratching, and stinking beneath the lace. It's like practicing perfect table manners while eating moldy leftovers. It looks refined on the outside, but the inside tells another story. One of the worst offenders was clothing. Versailles' fashion was heavy, layered, and rarely washed. Fabrics were expensive and delicate, so washing them could ruin them. Instead, stains were covered with embroidery or hidden beneath more layers. Dresses might smell faintly of smoke, grace, wine, and sweat all at once, but no one dared dunk them in water. Servants might brush them, beat out dust, or sponge the worst spots, but truly clean, never. And remember, bathrooms weren't exactly nearby. Accidents happened. Clothes were witnesses. They told silent, smelly stories of banquets and midnight indiscretions. The king himself wasn't immune. Louis XV took great care with his image, but he too avoided regular bathing. He preferred sponging with scented cloths, which left him smelling like a mixture of roses and man's sweat. His courtiers, desperate to flatter him, adopted the same habits. To be clean was not to be washed, but to be powdered and perfumed until dirt was invisible. And oh, the irony! Versailles was obsessed with appearances. A speck of dust on a shoe could ruin a reputation. A poorly tied cravat might destroy your social standing. But no one cared if your wig harbored lice, or your gown reeked faintly of urine. Image was everything, substance nothing. It was the Instagram filter of the 17th century: hide the flaws, exaggerate the glow, and hope no one looks too closely. Now, let's return to the perfumes for a moment, because some of them were less glamorous than you'd think. Many were made using animal secretions: civet from the anal glands of a civet cat, musk from deer glands, ambergris from whale intestines. These rich, musky bases gave perfumes their lasting power. So when a duchess leaned close, wafting her expensive scent, what you were really inhaling was a cocktail of flowers and animal guts. Romantic, isn't it? Servants, as always, suffered worst. They lived in cramped quarters where air rarely circulated, their own sweat and waste mixing with the palace's overall stench. Unlike nobles, they didn't have endless bottles of rosewater to splash around. Many simply endured. And when a servant carried a perfumed noble's gown through the hall, the scent clung to them like a shadow, mingling awkwardly with their own unwashed reality. By now you might be asking, did anyone notice how absurd this was? Yes, foreign visitors often wrote about it in letters. Ambassadors described Versailles as dazzling to the eyes, but nauseating to the nose. One remarked that the palace smelled like a perfumer's shop built atop a latrine. Another noted that the perfumes only made things worse, creating an odor both sweet and foul, impossible to escape. It was Versailles' signature scent, unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. And yet, within this stink and splendor, life carried on. Balls glittered, operas soared, kings and queens plotted, courtiers whispered secrets in mirrored halls. All the while, sweat soaked into velvet, lice feasted on scalps, teeth rotted, and perfumes battled a war they could never win. Versailles was not a palace of hygiene. It was a masquerade, where filth was the guest of honor hidden beneath silk masks. If you think the perfumes and powders were disturbing, wait until you see how Versailles dealt with food, how feasts left behind mountains of scraps, grace, and rot, mingling with the already pungent atmosphere. If you thought the body odors were bad, just wait until we step into the kitchens and cellars, where the smells of Versailles grew truly monstrous. The kitchens of Versailles were miracles of scale, engines designed to feed a monarch who believed his appetite was a symbol of his power. And yet, for all their size and importance, they were some of the foulest smelling spaces in the entire palace. Imagine a place where hundreds of cooks, scullions, and servants toiled over open fires, roasting meats, boiling soups, and frying fish. Now add the fact that refrigeration didn't exist, that meat often sat for days before being cooked, and that scraps were piled in corners or tossed out into courtyards to fester in the sun. If the palace was already a theatre of odors, the kitchens were the orchestra pit, loud, sweaty, and unrelenting. Picture walking into one of these kitchens. The first thing you'd feel is heat, an oppressive wave rolling off the massive hearths. Your eyes would sting from smoke, your clothes would immediately cling with the smell of grace. Then came the sides of beef hanging from hooks, half-plucked game birds strung up like ornaments, fish laid out on slabs with eyes already clouded. Rats skittered openly across the floor, bold as courtiers, knowing there was always something to gnaw. Cats patrolled as unofficial employees, though they often made more mess than they prevented. Dogs begged shamelessly for scraps, their paws slick with grease from the floor. It wasn't a kitchen so much as a carnival of chaos. The cooks themselves were no saints of cleanliness. Covered in flour, sweat, and grease, they hacked at meat with blades that were wiped on aprons rather than washed. Hands went from raw poultry to bread dough without pause. Vegetables, often unwashed, arrived caked in dirt. The kitchen smelled like smoke and roasting meat, yes, but beneath it lurked a sour undercurrent of rot and sweat, The kind of smell that creeps into your hair and refuses to leave. Food preparation at Versailles wasn't about nutrition or freshness. It was about spectacle. Meals were performances designed to awe, not to nourish. A banquet might include dozens of dishes, each more extravagant than the last. Swan roasted whole and reed dressed in feathers, pies with live birds inside that burst out when cut open, mountains of glazed meats, rivers of sauces so rich they could choke a horse. Flavor came not from freshness but from spices, sugar, and sauces heavy enough to mask the taste of meat just past its prime. A little rot, nothing a quart of nutmeg and cinnamon couldn't disguise. And the portions. Oh, the portions. Louis XIV himself was known for his prodigious appetite. He might consume multiple courses of soups, roasts, pastries, and fruit in a single sitting, washing it down with oceans of wine. Courtiers, eager to show their loyalty and stamina, followed suit. Plates piled high, grease dripping, crumbs scattering over silks and lace. Imagine a royal banquet as a kind of competitive eating contest, only in wigs and brocade. But where there is feasting, there is waste. Mountains of it. Uneaten food piled on plates, scraps tossed under tables, bones littering the floors. Servants rushed in to clear the debris, dumping it into buckets or tossing it into heaps outside. In summer, these heaps became playgrounds for flies, buzzing clouds so thick they seemed alive. The smell drifted back into the palace, mixing with perfume and sweat, until everything stank of grease and rot. And remember, there were thousands of mouths to feed at Versailles. Not just the king and queen, but courtiers, guards, musicians, servants, and guests. Every day was a logistical nightmare of bread, meat, wine, and fish. Deliveries arrived in carts that stank before they entered the gates. Fish especially. If you've ever smelled fish that's been left out too long, multiply that by wagon loads. By the time it reached Versailles, fresh was a polite fiction. But it was served anyway, disguised with enough butter and herbs to make diners forget. Or at least pretend to forget. The feasts themselves were performances of etiquette, but not always of manners. Courtiers jostled for position, grabbing the choicest cuts, wiping greasy fingers on napkins, or on clothes if they were careless. Dogs lurked under tables, snapping up fallen scraps. Bones might be hurled to the floor without a second thought. And when stomachs grew too full, some nobles slipped away to vomit discreetly so they could return and continue eating. Yes, Versailles invented the unofficial all-you-can-eat buffet, complete with second chances. If you wandered into the palace after a feast, you'd find the evidence everywhere, greasy stains on tablecloths, bones kicked into corners, puddles of spilled wine sticky underfoot. Servants scrubbed frantically, but the palace was too big, the meals too constant. Smells lingered, clinging to carpets and curtains, refusing to leave no matter how much rosewater was splashed. And just outside, piles of discarded food attracted rats and scavengers that flourished like unofficial guests of the king. Now imagine you're a visitor from a smaller court, stepping into Versailles for the first time. Your eyes widen at the splendor, the gold, the mirrors, the gowns. Then your nose twitches. Something sour, greasy, unmistakably fishy lurks beneath the rosewater. You take another step, and your shoe sticks slightly to the floor. You glance down and see the stain of last night's feast smeared into the flagstones. You look back up, and everyone is smiling, powdered, perfect, as though nothing is wrong. Versailles dazzled the eye and punished the nose. Modern comparison. Think of the aftermath of a huge wedding banquet, where no one cleaned up properly. Only multiply it by 1,000, add rats, and leave it festering for days. That was the Versailles rhythm feast, waste, stink, repeat. And yet, courtiers adored it. To be seen at a banquet was everything. To dine in the presence of the king was worth enduring the stink, the grease, even the questionable freshness of the food. Appearances mattered more than flavor or hygiene. Versailles was not about eating well, but about being seen eating. Behind the glittering banquets, however, lurked the true engine of Versailles' filth, the cellars. Here food was stored in massive quantities, barrels of wine, sacks of flour, sides of meat. Cool and dark, yes, but also damp and crawling with vermin. Rats nested in flour sacks, gnawed through salted meats, drowned in wine barrels. Servants waded through puddles of grease and rot to retrieve supplies, coughing at the mold that grew freely on walls. This was Versailles' dirty secret. The grandeur upstairs was built on squalor downstairs. And through it all, people carried on. They ate, they drank, they laughed, they danced. They ignored the smell. Or rather, they pretended it wasn't there, because to acknowledge it would shatter the illusion of Versailles as paradise. Better to perfume, to powder, to smile, and keep chewing. If you think this was bad, wait until you follow the waste of Versailles' food into the streets and ditches outside the palace. Because if you thought the kitchen stank, the disposal grounds made them look like a rose garden. That, dear traveller, is where Versailles crossed from disgusting to apocalyptic. Step outside the gilded halls for a breath of fresh air at Versailles, and you quickly learn how relative the word fresh can be. The gardens were masterpieces of geometry and grandeur, fountains leaping high into the sky, hedges trimmed to military precision. From a distance, it looked like paradise. But walk closer nose first, and paradise smelled a lot more like a compost heap left to rot in the sun. Everything the palace could not contain: chamber pots, spoiled food, broken furniture, kitchen waste, slaughtered animal remains, ended up outside. There was no neat disposal system, no organized sanitation crew. Servants dumped buckets into ditches, poured waste into courtyards, or simply hurled refuse over the walls. What accumulated was a landscape of filth encircling the very symbol of French power. Versailles might have been the beating heart of a monarchy, but its arteries were clogged with garbage. Imagine strolling the outer courtyards on a summer day. The first thing that would hit you is the smell, thick, sour, and almost chewy in the air. Piles of refuse steamed under the sun, buzzing with flies, crawling with maggots. Dogs rolled in the heaps, delighted with their discoveries. Children of servants played nearby, immune to the stench. Their laughter carried on the same breeze that brought the odor to unsuspecting noses. Rats scurried between carcasses of half-eaten animals, fat and brazen. And it wasn't just trash. Human waste was flung out with equal abandon. Chamber pots emptied from windows created sticky puddles in alleys, often seeping into gardens or trickling into the ornamental lakes. Guests wandering among fountains might pass a hedge hiding not a marble statue, but a stinking heap of last night's chamber pots. Versailles was a palace of fountains and latrines in equal measure, and sometimes they were indistinguishable. The irony was almost comic. Louis XIV had built Versailles to showcase absolute order, a place where even the gardens obeyed geometric precision, where courtiers danced to rules as strict as military drill, yet outside the walls, chaos reigned. Waste didn't respect symmetry. It piled in uneven heaps. It spread, it seeped. Versailles wanted to be the sun at the center of the universe, but its orbit was circled by garbage. Visitors from abroad often commented on this contradiction. They marveled at the fountains, yes, but then wrinkled their noses at the smell. Letters home described Versailles as a jewel set in a swamp of filth. Some even suggested that the palace looked best from a distance, where one couldn't smell its reality. Close up, the stink clung to clothes, hair, and memory, following guests long after they left. The disposal grounds had their own economy. Scavengers picked through piles for bones, cloth, or scraps of food. Stray animals gorged themselves. Servants sometimes returned to the heaps to retrieve objects accidentally tossed. Silver cutlery swept up with bones, jewels lost in the frenzy of a banquet. One can imagine a maid pawing through rotting carcasses to rescue a candlestick worth more than her annual wage. Versailles' waste was disgusting, but it was also valuable. In wet weather, the problem multiplied. Rain turned the heaps into sludge that spread across paths and seeped into cellars. Courtyards became quagmires, sucking at shoes, coating hems with filth. Carriages splashed through puddles, spraying bystanders with a foul mixture of mud and waste. The glittering nobles inside hardly noticed, though the servants, who had to clean their carriages afterwards, certainly did. And the smell. Rain didn't wash it away. It only stirred it, releasing fresh waves of stench into the air. Then there were the fountains themselves. They were marvels of engineering, fed by aqueducts and pumps that strained to meet the palace's thirst. But water and waste existed side by side. Drainage from refuse heaps sometimes seeped into the same channels that fed the fountains. Imagine sipping from a goblet, while admiring a jet of sparkling water, knowing that somewhere upstream, the stream had carried away chamber pot contents. Of course, nobles preferred not to imagine such things. Denial was easier. The surrounding village of Versailles bore the brunt of this overflow. Residents lived in the shadow of a palace that consumed resources endlessly and produced waste just as endlessly. Streets clogged with palace refuse, local wells fouled by runoff, gardens ruined by stinking ditches. To live near Versailles was to live with the side effects of its splendor. And yet, many endured, hoping for crumbs from the royal table, sometimes literally. Servants and villagers scavenged palace waste for edible scraps, bread crusts, or meat still clinging to bones. Hunger made the disgusting tolerable. Modern comparison. Imagine living next to the world's most luxurious 5-star hotel. Except the dumpsters were never emptied and overflowed into your yard daily. That was Versailles for its neighbors, a paradise for the few, a landfill for the many. Despite the filth, or perhaps because of it, Versailles developed a peculiar resilience. Life continued. Balls glittered, operas echoed, the gardens bloomed. Courtiers powdered themselves, ignoring the stink rising just outside the windows. They danced as if surrounded by roses, not rotting heaps. To acknowledge the truth would have been treason against the illusion of grandeur. Better to hold your lace handkerchief to your nose and pretend. But here's the cruel punchline: waste doesn't vanish. It lingers. It seeps into soil, into water, into memory. Versailles could geld its walls, perfume its halls, and choreograph its gardens, but it could never escape its own filth. That filth clung not only to marble but to reputation. When revolution came, many remembered Versailles less as a shining palace, and more as a symbol of excess layered over rot. The stink of waste became a metaphor for the monarchy itself, outwardly magnificent, inwardly decaying. And if you think the grounds outside were revolting, wait until we descend into the personal hygiene rituals, or lack thereof, of the courtiers themselves. Because beneath the wigs, lace, and perfume lurked bodies that were seldom washed, mouths that reeked, and skin that told the truth no powder could hide. If you thought Versailles smelled bad from the outside, just wait until you get under the skin. If Versailles had a smell, and it certainly did, it wasn't just the chamber pots, the courtyards, or the heaps of waste fermenting outside. It was the people themselves. Beneath the wigs and lace, beneath the brocade gowns and satin coats, Versailles was a crowded theatre of unwashed bodies pressed together in relentless proximity. For all the marble and mirrors, the palace was still a greenhouse for sweat, musk, and breath, every pore and cavity announcing its presence in ways perfume could only partly disguise. Bathing, for the noble class, was a complicated subject. The prevailing belief of the time was that water opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to sickness. To submerge oneself in a tub of water was to invite death in through every softened follicle. So courtiers avoided bathing with an almost heroic determination. A nobleman might boast that he hadn't washed fully in years. A noblewoman might dab herself with a cloth dipped in wine or vinegar and declare herself refreshed. Whole bodies were seldom immersed in water, at best. Specific areas were freshened with scented cloths, powders, or oils. The result was that human beings at Versailles wore their history on their skin. Sweat, dust, and perfume layered like geological strata. Imagine hugging someone who hadn't washed for months, whose only defense was a generous cloud of musk. Now imagine doing that in a room filled with 500 of those people, all jostling for proximity to the king. Welcome to a Versailles reception. Hair added another dimension. Wigs were the pinnacle of fashion, towering constructions of curls, braids, and ribbons. They were also habitats. Lice thrived in wigs, and though powder might mask their presence, it didn't exterminate them. Some courtiers had special scratching sticks to discreetly relieve itching beneath their elaborate coiffures. Servants combed wigs at night, sometimes discovering whole colonies of vermin. Powder, meant to whiten and perfume, often mingled with sweat and oil until wigs became stiff, foul-smelling helmets perched on irritated scalps. Teeth were no better. Dentistry was primitive, and sugar was abundant in the aristocratic diet. Rotten teeth, abscesses, and bad breath were so common that one might call them fashionable. Courtiers smiled through pain, their mouths filled with cavities. Their words carried on the sour wind of decay. Kissing hands, a daily ritual at Versailles, meant drawing dangerously close to breath that could make a rose wilt. Lovers exchanged more than affection. They shared bacteria infection, and occasionally a few loose teeth. Powder and perfume were the great equalizers. To survive in this atmosphere, one didn't strive to be clean, one strove to smell clean. Or at least smell stronger than the person beside you. Courtiers carried pomanders, small, ornate containers of aromatic herbs or vinegar-soaked sponges, to hold discreetly to their noses. Perfume was dabbed on clothes, wigs, even furniture. Entire rooms were fumigated with incense. The air was thick with competing scents: rose, lavender, musk, amber, civet. It was an olfactory battlefield, where victory went to the strongest cloud. But the body has a way of asserting itself. Perfume didn't erase the sour tang of sweat, the rancid sweetness of decay, or the metallic edge of infected gums. Instead, it mingled, creating a bouquet both intoxicating and nauseating. Imagine entering a room where 50 perfumes clash, each fighting to dominate, all layered atop a base note of unwashed humanity. It was less like walking into a garden, and more like stumbling into a chemical accident at a flower shop. And yet this was considered normal, even desirable. A pale, powdered complexion was prized as a mark of nobility, even if it was achieved by smearing one's face with lead-based cosmetics. Lead whitened the skin but poisoned it over time, causing ulcers, hair loss, and a ghostly pallor. But what was a little poisoning compared to looking fashionable? Rouge added color to the cheeks, often so thickly applied it cracked like paint on old plaster. Beneath the makeup, the skin festered, but appearance mattered more than health. Versailles was a stage, and courtiers actors desperate never to exit. Clothing added to the problem. Layer upon layer of fabric, tightly laced, suffocated the body and trapped sweat. A woman might wear stays, shifts, petticoats, gowns, and mantles, each adding heat and restricting movement. Men sweltered in coats, waistcoats, stockings, and breeches. Changing clothes daily was common for the wealthy, but laundering them was rare. Fabrics soaked up odors until garments became archives of their wearer's life. To borrow someone's coat was to borrow their history, quite literally, their smell. The palace's heat didn't help. Fires blazed in winter, candles smoked year-round, and crowds gathered constantly. The air grew thick, the walls absorbed it, the hangings trapped it. Versailles was less a palace and more a slow, cooking stew of humanity, constantly simmering. One imagines the scent clinging to tapestries and upholstery, waiting to be released whenever a curtain was drawn or a cushion pressed. For the servants who lived in closer quarters, things were even worse. Cramped dormitories, few chamber pots, and little ventilation meant that odor became a constant companion. Washing was rare, clothing was patched and repatched, and infestations of lice or fleas were ordinary. Yet these servants were the ones brushing the nobles' wigs, handling their perfumes, and dabbing their foreheads with scented cloths. In a sense, the servants were the filters of Versailles, absorbing some of its filth so the aristocracy could pretend at elegance. Of course, not everyone accepted this happily. Foreign visitors were often horrified. Letters described the smell of Versailles as unforgettable, and not in a flattering way. Some remarked that the palace was more bearable in winter, when the cold masked the odors. In summer, though, the truth bloomed. Imagine stepping into a gilded hall expecting heaven, and being greeted by the earthy reality of a crowded barnyard in heat. The contrast was jarring enough to etch itself permanently into memory. Yet despite all this, the courtiers carried on. They powdered, they perfumed, they preened. They embraced one another, whispered secrets, exchanged kisses, danced, and laughed, all while surrounded by the unmistakable reminder that they were, at base, animals. Versailles was both a temple of civilization and a celebration of denial. The body refused to be tamed, and the more the courtiers tried to mask it, the more grotesque the illusion became. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The palace was built to display absolute control over nature, over people, over perception. Yet it could never control its own most basic truth that underneath the lace and gold, humanity stank. The courtiers might have convinced themselves otherwise, but anyone with a nose knew the truth. Versailles wasn't just a palace of mirrors, it was a palace of smells, each one telling the story of bodies denied water, mouths denied care, and skins denied air. If you think the reek of sweat, powder, and rot was unbearable, just wait until we wander into the dining halls, because what went in always had to come out. And Versailles' feasts were legendary, not only for their extravagance, but for the digestive consequences that followed. If Versailles had a theatre more dramatic than the opera hall, it was the dining chamber. Here, the act of eating became performance, a ritual so choreographed that even chewing seemed like part of the king's bollet. At first glance, the spectacle dazzled glittering candelabras, silver dishes stacked with meats, fruits gleaming like jewels, and wines poured until the table itself seemed drunk. But stay a while, sniff the air, listen closely, and you'll realize that dining at Versailles was not so much a feast for the senses as an assault. The meals began with grandeur. Trumpets blared, announcing the arrival of the king. Courtiers jockeyed for proximity, not to the food, but to the privilege of watching the monarch eat. Yes, many nobles weren't there to dine. They were there to witness the royal chewing, as if crumbs from the king's lips contained spiritual nourishment. Imagine being invited to a banquet where your role was not to taste, but to observe someone else devouring a roast swan. It was theatre in its purest form. The dishes themselves defied reason. Roasted boars, entire stags, delicate quail, pastries shaped like fortresses. Sauces so heavy with butter they could have lubricated a carriage wheel. Food piled high, steaming and fragrant, yet most of it destined to go uneaten. The king might sample a bite, and that morsel instantly became the most important piece of meat in Europe. Servants whisked away leftovers by the wagon load. Meanwhile, the kitchens churned constantly, a smoky inferno that consumed forests worth of firewood, and churned out enough grease to fuel a small navy. But luxury did not equal hygiene. Kitchens reeked of sweat and smoke. Meat spoiled quickly in summer heat, and flies buzzed over open platters. Spices and sauces weren't just for flavor. They were camouflage, designed to mask the tang of meat already turning. Noble stomachs, accustomed to rich food and little exercise, were often delicate. Indigestion, gout, and constipation became badges of aristocracy, suffered through with grim dignity. To eat like a king was to ache like one afterward. And then there was the matter of table manners, or lack thereof. Forks existed, but were often ignored. Many courtiers plunged hands directly into dishes, licking fingers before reaching again. Bonds were tossed onto the floor, where dogs eagerly snapped them up. Grace smeared across embroidered sleeves, crumbs rained down onto velvet breeches. Servants swept constantly, but the tide of debris was endless. The grandest dining chamber in Europe doubled as a trough. The sounds matched the scene. Chewing, slurping, belching. These were not fox pass but punctuation marks of satisfaction. To burp audibly was not shameful. It was a compliment to the chef. The collective noise of hundreds feasting created a symphony of mastication, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a goblet, or the thud of a dropped joint of meat. Add to this the king's hunting dogs barking for scraps, and one might mistake the hall for a barn during feeding time. And of course, what went in had to come out. With wine flowing like water and meat consumed in heroic quantities, the digestive consequences were swift. Chamber pots lurked nearby, sometimes filled during meals behind discreet screens. Imagine enjoying a tart while someone on the other side of the room noisily relieved themselves. It happened. At banquets lasting hours, courtiers could not simply excuse themselves to a private corner. The palace had few facilities, and time was precious. Nature's calls were answered within earshot of clinking glasses. The aftermath was no cleaner. Tables crusted with grease, bones, and spilled wine awaited armies of servants, who scraped, swept, and salvaged. The stench lingered, meat, sweat, wine, and candle wax blending into a perfume that haunted the hall, even after every dish was cleared. Carpets soaked with wine, walls stained with smoke, ceilings coated with soot. Versailles ate in splendor, but the splendor always came with residue. The irony, of course, was that most of the palace lived in hunger. Servants, villagers outside the gates, even lesser nobles often had little to eat beyond stale bread or scraps. Yet within the halls, mountains of food were wasted daily, discarded to rot in the already overflowing courtyards. Versailles was a palace that consumed itself, its appetite insatiable, its waste inevitable. Modern comparison. Picture the world's fanciest all-you-can-eat buffet, but the guests never wash their hands, never use plates properly, and half the food is spoiled by the time it reaches the table. Now add an audience watching someone else eat and applauding when he burps. That was Versailles dining in a nutshell, or in a wine-soaked bread crust. And yet, the courtiers adored it. To eat at Versailles or even to watch someone else eat, was to participate in the very heartbeat of power. Food wasn't nourishment. It was theatre, symbolism, and domination. The king dined, therefore he ruled. Every greasy mouthful was another demonstration that resources could be squandered at will, while others starved. The mess was part of the message here. Excess reigned, but excess has consequences. Overstuffed bodies swelled with disease, bellies ached, tempers flared. And when the revolution came, one of the most enduring symbols hurled at the monarchy was food. The people demanded bread, while Versailles wallowed in banquets. The stink of grace and waste was not just physical. It became political, an odor that never quite dissipated, even after the palace gates were stormed. And so we leave Versailles, not with the glitter of gold or the sparkle of fountains, but with the smell of spoiled meat, the slosh of wine across the floor, the murmur of indigestion echoing in the corridors. For all its beauty, the palace was never truly clean. Beneath the mirrors, beneath the chandeliers, Versailles was always a feast balanced on a heap of filth.